Hi, welcome to this new biology tutorial video. This video corresponds with chapter 14.3 in your textbook, and it's titled Population Density and Distribution. And in this video and in the next video, I hope to highlight a key aspect of ecology, and that is that ecologists, the people who are studying ecology, typically use math to model and describe and analyze and experiment with things that are ecological. So I hope to prove to you in this video that math is a very important skill to have if you're going to be an ecologist and if you're going to help understand the answers to some ecological questions. So let's go ahead and get started with this video. So before we carry on anymore with the talk about populations, let's review what we already know about populations, which is this, the definition of a population. It's that it's a group of individuals of the same species in a particular area. You can see these birds here. These are northern gannets, and they live in the northern hemisphere, and they're ocean birds. And so you see they're nesting here on the edge of the ocean, and these birds are all the same species of bird, the same kind of bird, and they're all living in the same area. And so an ecologist can focus on this group or population of birds and actually do some experiments or attempt to get answers to some ecological questions about these birds. If an ecologist were to try to get answers about a group of northern gannets all over the world, that would be pretty much impossible. And so ecologists focus on specific regions of the world, a state or a city or maybe a bigger region than that. But the reality is an ecologist can really only experiment and try to answer questions about a population that's in a particular area rather than wondering all about the same kind of species as they exist all over the world. It's just not doable. So a population is a very important unit for ecologists, and it comes into play in this video and in this topic of population density and distribution. So the first new term for this video is population density. It's the number of individuals living in a defined space. The emperor penguins in the photograph on the left are packed much tighter against one another in the same space as compared to the penguins in the photograph on the right-hand side. If we assume that these two photographs were taken at the same spot, which they weren't, but if we assume that maybe the photograph on the right-hand side was taken at a different time of season or a different time of day, and there are just fewer penguins in the given space, if we assume that the space for each photograph is roughly the same. So we would say that the left-hand photograph has a much higher population density of emperor penguins than the photograph on the right-hand side, which has a lower population density. And remember, it's the number of individuals in the defined space. And ecologists have to define the space in order to find the population density. And we use a very easy equation to calculate population density. It's simply the number of individuals divided by the area, whatever that area may be. It may be a square mile, it may be several square miles, it could be a few square meters. It depends on what organism you're talking about. In the case of penguins, it's probably square meters. We would want to know how many penguins per square meters or per 10 square meters of space there are. And we would do a simple calculation. So let's say there were 100 penguins for every 100 square meters. That looks like 100 square meters approximately in the foreground of this photograph. And of course, that would calculate as 1 penguin per square meter. So you have 100 penguins in 100 square meters. Naturally, you do that division, and it's 1 penguin per square meter. That doesn't seem like a lot. But let's say we take the photograph with the higher density of emperor penguins. Let's say there are 500 penguins in the same space, 100 square meters. Well, that calculates simply down to 5 penguins per square meter. So each penguin is sharing its square meter with 4 other penguins, whereas in the previous calculation, every penguin had his own or her own square meter to inhabit or to be in or do whatever it is that they were doing in that square meter. So we would say that this photograph has a much higher population density of penguins, 5 versus 1 in the previous calculation. The next new term in this video is population dispersion, and this is a little bit different than density. It's the way in which individuals in the population are spread out in the area, whatever area that may be. And one way they can be spread out is in a uniform pattern or a uniform dispersion. And you can see here that these penguins are kind of spaced out relatively equally. And you can see in the diagram right here, the square that these dots represent the penguins in the photograph, they're kind of spread out relatively evenly. They're all the same distance from each other approximately. And we call that uniform dispersion. And we usually find this in populations of organisms where there is a pretty decent level of competition or territoriality. So these these penguins here, for example, are very territorial. They're looking after a very defined space because they need that space in order to build a nest and to raise chicks. And so they're going to compete for that space. And when they do compete equally for all these spaces, they end up being sort of uniformly spread out from one another. They have all the space that they need, and the penguin next to them has exactly the same amount of space, or approximately the same amount of space. This is also a characteristic dispersion for individuals that need to live at specific distances from each other. For example, birds is a pretty good example of this. A blue jay or a cardinal or a sparrow is going to defend a tree that it can build its nest in because it can't handle more than one bird's nest in that tree for reasons of competition and food availability and things like that. So when you see a uniform dispersion, you should ask yourself, why are these organisms spaced out in such a uniform pattern? And again, it's usually because of competition. They're kind of shouldering each other aside and giving each other the space that they need. And the amount of space they need is characteristic of that given species. Penguins are pretty big birds, and so they need a decent amount of space around them in order to build a nest and raise their young and eat food and things like that. But you can imagine that an insect or something would need much smaller space, but could still be distributed in a uniform pattern. The next kind of dispersion is clumped, and you can see in this photograph these fish are swimming in a small school, and we typically see this in fish and also birds and even in insects and a lot of other organisms as well. But they're clumped, so they're not uniformly distributed in their habitat or in their small area. They're kind of in these clumps, and these clumps can be various sizes. They can be clumps of 1,000 organisms. They can be clumps of just 5 organisms. But either way, an ecologist would classify this type of dispersion as clumped. And we know that this is for protection usually. These fish swim in schools because they know they're protected if they sort of look like a bigger organism if they all swim together. And if one were to be preyed on, the ones on the outside of the clumped distribution would actually get preyed upon first. And so it's kind of a protection strategy. They can also feed cooperatively or do something else cooperatively if they're all clumped together. If they're all spaced out uniformly or in a random pattern, they can't necessarily cooperate with each other to do anything. And typically they're cooperating with each other to collect food so that they all get more food than if they were to simply swim around by themselves. And also you can imagine that as a clumped pattern or in a clumped dispersion, you might also get better mating because the organisms you're trying to mate with, the members of your species in your population, are right next to you. And so when it comes time for mating, it sort of facilitates that whole process. So depending on the type of dispersion, we can tell something about this kind of organism and the way that it lives its life. The last kind of dispersion is random dispersion, and we don't see this very often except in most plant populations. You see, a lot of plants are distributed by seeds, and a lot of seeds are distributed either by animals that might eat the fruit that has the seeds in it, or maybe those seeds are distributed by the wind. And when those seeds fall to the ground, they kind of fall to the ground in a very random pattern. The wind can't set them down in a uniform pattern, and if they don't clump together, because if they're not sticky or something, then they're not going to come down and germinate in a clumped pattern, and so you're going to see a very random pattern. So grasses, or in this case dandelion weeds, this population of dandelions is in a random dispersion. There's really no rhyme or reason to their dispersion pattern. It looks kind of uniform because they're all kind of spaced out relatively evenly, but not as evenly as those penguins were in the uniform distribution photograph. So it's a random dispersion, and again, we rarely see this in animals. There's really no reason for animals to be in a random dispersion. They're usually keeping an eye on each other. They're usually territorial, usually competing to some extent for food or shelter or space. But plants tend to simply cast their seeds out, and wherever the seeds fall, that's where the new members of the population will germinate and grow and live. And so this is a very characteristic dispersion of plants. The next part of our video is all about survivorship, and this has to do with following a group of organisms that are born or brought into the population and following them over the course of their lifetime and deciding when they die, or at least recording when they die. And so we can develop a formula or a graph or something over time that sort of depicts how the organisms are surviving. Are a lot dying really soon after they're born, or are they living for long periods of time? So if you look at this data right here, you can see that if a group of organisms are born, for example, let's say 35. So let's say in age 0 to 5, you have 35 individuals. And in that time, let's say one dies, so we'll subtract 1 for a total of 34. That means there's a total of 97% of the original 35 that are still surviving. And then in years 6 through 10, you get maybe one more death, so we'll subtract 1. And so they're dying off kind of slowly here. And so you have 33. So 33 divided by 35 is a 94% survivorship there. And from years 11 to 15, maybe none of them die, but then in later years, 16 through 20, maybe 4 of them die. So again, we're doing a little bit more subtraction. 83% of them are surviving at that point. And then in years 21 through 25, if this organism lives that long, maybe 1 more dies. And again, you have 80%. So this survivorship shows that a lot of organisms are still present year after year after year after year. Not a lot of organisms are dying. And that tells us something about their lifestyle. So let's talk about that. This is a survivorship curve graph, and I want you to know this graph. It depicts 3 types of survivorship curves that ecologists have defined over the years. And these survivorship curves, again, help describe the reproductive strategy and the life history of the species. That's how the species live and how, over time, members of its species either live or die. Type 1 curve is very characteristic of humans. You can see that on the y-axis, we have the number of survivors. That's over here on the vertical axis. So at the beginning, when all the organisms are born into the population in a given year, there's 100% of them. And then as time goes on this orange line, you can see that in a human population, for example, young people dying is actually a very rare occurrence. So you have young people that are living, and they're living, and they're living, and we're not losing too many of them from a group that's born at a certain time. But then as life goes on and goes on, as we go further down the x-axis here, you can see that as people get older and older, more of them are dying, and then more of them are dying, and that makes sense because humans die of old age, and humans and other mammals and other large animals typically follow a type 1 curve. Now, the green line is a type 2 curve. This is typical of smaller animals and also animals that are not warm-blooded, for example, reptiles or amphibians or something like that. And so again, at the beginning, when a bunch of them are born, 100% of them are living because none of them have died yet. But then instead of just a few of them dying off over the years, they get actually a fair number of them dying off over the years, but it's a very constant rate of death to the point where at the end of the maximum lifespan of this creature, for example, this lizard here, all of them will be dead. So this tells us that over time, a fair number of them are getting eaten, getting preyed upon by a predator, or succumbing to some kind of disease. And so again, we typically see type 2 survivorship curves in animals that are smaller, on the smaller side, and also animals that are not warm-blooded or that are cold-blooded, like our reptiles. And again, the green line simply depicts that a decent number of them are dying over time, but they're not dying quicker or slower over time. They're actually dying at this very constant rate. That's why the green line is very straight. And then we have a type 3 survivorship curve, and that's typically for very small creatures and also invertebrates, things like mollusks like this snail here, or jellyfish, or sea stars, or insects, for example. And so you can see that, again, at the beginning of the time when a group of them are born, there is 100% of them. But then very quickly, a lot of them die off. They're either so small that a lot of organisms can eat them very quickly or prey upon them very quickly or something like that. And then a lot of them die very, very quickly. But then as time goes on, so many of them have died that there's not as many of them left over anymore. And so predators and other organisms that would pick them off or eat them or collect them for some reason can't find them as easily. And so in this part of the graph, you can see here I'm highlighting with my cursor, later on in life of a snail, for example, or an insect or a small invertebrate, there's just so few of them left from a group that was born, several years ago, that they're just not easy to find, and so they're just dying off at actually a very slow rate. So you can see this blue line, or the type 3 survivorship curve, is kind of the opposite of the type 1, or the orange curve here. And again, type 1 is very typical of large animals, including humans and a lot of mammals. Type 2 is very characteristic of your sort of smaller sized animals. And then the type 3 survivorship curve, where a lot of them are dying very quickly, but then not so much in the latter part of their life, are very small creatures, and a lot of our invertebrates, a lot of organisms that live in the ocean, like corals and anemones and jellyfish and things like that. So that's what survivorship curves are all about. They help us describe what's going on over time. It helps us understand their reproductive strategy. It also helps us understand the life history of the species. What is happening over time as a group of a species is living their life, whatever the length of their life may actually be. So let's do a little summary before we end today's video. First thing is that a population is a group of individuals of the same species in a particular area, and that's from a previous video, so I think you know that. The next thing here is that population density is the number of individuals living in a defined space or a defined area. And remember, ecologists like to define that area because it's easy to study. If you're living in a certain town or a certain state, or you're studying a certain pond or lake or forest, you define that space and you can calculate the population density of whatever species you're investigating. And there's a very simple calculation you can see here to calculate population density. You simply count the number of individuals and divide that by the area. Whatever that area may be, that may be a small area, it may be a medium-sized area, it may be an extremely large area, but it's got to be in square units, so square inches or square meters or square miles. Those are very different sized areas, but they're all square areas. The next item here is that population dispersion is the way in which individuals are spread out in an area. And remember, they can be in a uniform dispersion, a clumped dispersion, or a random dispersion. And that tells us a little bit about that organism. And lastly, we have this concept of survivorship curves. Those are those charts, the graphs that I just showed you, that help describe how a species reproduces, whether they produce a lot of offspring or maybe they don't produce a lot of offspring, and then over time, how do those offspring fare? Are a lot of them eaten very quickly, and so a lot of them die in that population very quickly? Or is it more characteristic of, say, large animals like humans, where in the young life of a large animal, such as a human, there's not a lot of them dying off. But then as those organisms get older, as humans get older, we tend to die more quickly from a group that's born at the same time because we die of old age, and that's just how it happens. The main thing here before we end our video is to highlight the ecological principle from this video, and that is that populations can be described and analyzed mathematically, whether we're calculating the density or somehow measuring the dispersion, the space in between one organism and another in an ecosystem, or whether we're analyzing a graph of a survivorship curve, which remember is simply the number of individuals that are surviving still in any given year following a group that's born into that population. So I want you to appreciate the fact that ecologists are using a lot of mathematics to describe populations, to describe ecology, and to help answer ecological questions. So there's our video for section 14.3, and I'll see you in our next video.